Hi, Dr. Scott Jensen here. It's Sunday, August 13th, 2023, and it's around noontime. Today I want to talk to you about three basic axioms. One, follow the money. Two, follow the fraud. Three, follow the corruption. A while back, I spoke about the fact that medical journal articles were being withdrawn from the public square, that journal articles that had been used to potentially promote a perspective during the last 3 years were being withdrawn and they were disappearing from the public square in an unprecedented fashion. I'd certainly never seen it before in my medical career to the level that it was going on. Well, today I want to talk about the conclusion I left you with last time. I said, we need to follow the money. Today I'm saying we have to follow the money. In order to do that, we have to follow the fraud, and that oftentimes involves following the corruption. So let's start with an article from The Guardian, August 9th, 2023, and it says this: there's far more scientific fraud than anyone wants to admit. The article is written by Ivan Oransky and Adam Marcus. And here is a highlighted sentence. Scientific misconduct has enjoyed some limelight lately. The president of Stanford, Mark Tessier-Lavigne, resigned last month after a series of investigations exposed serious problems in his research. His research failed standards of scientific rigor and process. He resigned. The president of Stanford University. And it goes on to say, of course, scientific misconduct does not happen only at Stanford and Harvard. And it went on to say this: retractions have risen sharply in recent years for two main reasons. First, sleuthing, largely by volunteers who comb academic literature for anomalies. And second, major publishers recognize that their business models have made them susceptible to paper mills, scientific chop shops that sell everything from authorships to entire manuscripts to researchers who need to publish lest they perish. I'm a former adjunct professor at a major university medical school, and I understand how some of my colleagues at that time were under pressure to publish. If you don't publish, you won't get the periodic promotions that you might otherwise get. You need to publish. If you're going to publish, you have to do research. If you have to do research, you have to find the funding. And if you find someone who's willing to fund your research and you don't come up with the conclusions that they were hoping for, they probably won't fund you in the future. This article also says this: one of the main reasons scientists feel pressure to cut corners or fudge data is because funding rates are so low. The United States National Institute of Health last year approved about 20% of applications for new grants. That's 1 out of 5. Who is the largest source of funding for research? You guessed it, pharma. So why is the president of Stanford resigning? Well, if we go back in time, we can find some information that might provide a clue. Let's go back more than a dozen years. May 5th, 2010, an article in MinnPost written by Susan Perry. And the title of the article is this: ex-editor of New England Journal of Medicine tells how big pharma has corrupted academic institutions. This discusses Dr. Marcia Angell, who is a former editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine. She writes a book, The Truth About the Drug Companies. And this is something what she wrote. The boundaries between academic medicine, medical schools, teaching hospitals, and their faculty, and the pharmaceutical industry have been dissolving since the 1980s, and the important differences between their missions are becoming blurred. The important differences between their missions are becoming blurred. Medical research, education, and clinical practice have suffered as a result. It goes on to say, this article says this: to a remarkable extent, medical centers have become supplicants to the drug companies, deferring to them in ways that would have been unthinkable even 20 years ago. Often, academic researchers are little more than hired hands who supply human subjects and collect data according to instructions from corporate paymasters. The sponsors keep the data, analyze it, write the papers, and decide whether and when and where to submit them for publication. The sponsors do that. That would be the pharmaceuticals. In multi-center trials, researchers may not even be allowed to see all of the data, an obvious impediment to science and a perversion of standard practice. In other words, the researchers, the scientists whose names are on these publications may not even see all of the data. The article goes on to say, academic leaders, chairs, and even deans sit on boards of directors of drug companies. Here's another point. Conflicts of interest affect more than research. They also directly shape the way medicine is practiced through their influence on practice guidelines issued by professional and governmental bodies and through their effects on FDA decisions. This Dr. Angel offers several examples, including this one. In 2004, after the NIH, National Cholesterol Education Program, called for sharply lowering the acceptable levels of bad cholesterol, it was revealed that 8 of 9 members of the panel writing the recommendations had financial ties to the makers of cholesterol-lowering drugs. The corruption is unmistakable. Another point, drug companies support educational programs even within our best medical schools and teaching hospitals and are given virtually unfettered access to young doctors. Doctors and their patients come to believe that for every ailment and discontent, there is a drug, even when changes in lifestyle would be more effective. And they believe that the newest, most expensive brand name drugs are superior to older drugs or generics, even though there is seldom any evidence to that effect, because sponsors don't usually compare their drugs with older drugs at equivalent doses. Oftentimes, all that a new drug tries to identify is that they are not inferior to the present drug that might be generic. Not inferior. In other words, they're not necessarily coming out and saying, this is a superior drug and that's why you should pay a lot more money for it. They're simply saying, our new drug is not inferior. Doesn't that sort of sound outlandish? Here's another article. It's called Society for Participatory Medicine. It's written by an author named ePatient Dave, March 20, 2012, more than a decade ago. It says this about Dr. Marcia Angel, the one I just referenced, the former editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine. Well-known, respected physician, longtime editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. It is simply no longer possible to believe much of the clinical research that is published or to rely on the judgment of trusted physicians or authoritative medical guidelines. I take no pleasure in this conclusion, which I reached slowly and reluctantly over my 2 decades as an editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. This is Dr. Angel. This article goes on to say that her comments echoed the comments of Richard Smith, 25-year editor of another top-tier journal, the British Medical Journal, who said this: most of what appears in peer-reviewed journals is scientifically weak. Then they go on to comment about Dr. Relman, who also was an editor for the New England Journal of Medicine. In 1984, Dr. Relman became the first editor of a medical journal to require authors to disclose financial ties to their subject matter and to publish those disclosures. In 2015, we go a few years forward, DrugWatch provided this article, and the article's title was Big Pharma's Role in Clinical Trials. And it says this: data from clinical trials are important in proving new medicines and discovering new treatments. But Big Pharma funds and runs most clinical trials. According to critics, this could allow drug companies to fake study results or hide dangerous side effects to get their drug approved or increase sales. Each year, the National Institute of Health budget provides less money to fund clinical trials. Because of this, Big Pharma pays for and runs the majority of these trials. And then it goes on to say this. For example, the New England Journal of Medicine, one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world, published 73 studies of new drugs. Of those studies, a pharmaceutical company funded 60 of them, 60 out of 73, and 37 lead researchers. Out of 73 studies, 37 lead researchers had accepted money from a drug company, according to a review conducted by the Washington Post. So you start to get the flavor. We've got Big Pharma literally funding the studies and identifying how and where they'll be published and as to whether or not the conclusions of the research is what they want it to be. We've got scientists and researchers in desperate need of funding for their future research. You can start to see, follow the money, follow the fraud, follow the corruption. Maybe a specific example would be helpful to bring this into sharp focus. Let's go to a drug called Vioxx, V-I-O-X-X. Let's go to an article, November 14th, 2004, more than 2 decades ago, the New York Times. Here's what it says. In May 2000, executives at Merck made a fateful decision. The company's top research and marketing executives met that month to consider whether to develop a study to directly test a disturbing possibility that Vioxx, a painkiller, their painkiller, might pose a heart risk. 2 months earlier, results from a clinical trial conducted for other reasons had suggested such concerns regarding a potential heart risk. Paragraph. But the executives rejected pursuing a study focused on Vioxx's cardiovascular risks. Instead, Merck officials decided to monitor clinical trials. It was a recurring theme for the company over the next few years that Vioxx was safe unless proved otherwise. But a detailed reconstruction of Merck's handling of Vioxx suggests that the actions the company took and did not take soon after the drug's safety was questioned may have affected the health of potentially thousands of patients. The New York Times article goes on to say this. In late September, more than 4 years after that May 2000 meeting, Merck announced that it was pulling the drug off the market because a long-term clinical trial showed that some patients, after taking the drug for 18 months, developed serious cardiovascular problems. When studies on Vioxx and other drugs became available in 1988 and 1999, many doctors were disappointed. Neither drug, Vioxx or the study that they were referring to, Celebrex in this article, neither drug alleviated pain any better than the older medicines. And the drugs cost almost $3 a pill. Over-the-counter pain relievers, in contrast, cost pennies a dose. The New York Times article goes on to say this. The data that first alerted Merck to the heart risks with Vioxx arrived in March of 2000, and it was derived from a study of 8,100 rheumatoid arthritis patients, begun in January of 1999. In the study called VIGOR, V-I-G-O-R, patients were treated with Vioxx or naproxen, I should say. While Vioxx reduced the risk of internal bleeding, it also appeared to raise the incidence of heart problems. 5 times as many patients with taking Vioxx had heart attacks as those taking naproxen. Merck said it believed the differences resulted not with problems with Vioxx, but from naproxen's strong protective effect on the heart. So it wasn't because Merck had a problem, it was just that naproxen, the generic drug that Vioxx was replacing, happened to be so strongly protective of the heart. You get the message? They're going to play it any way they need to. That was the article in the New York Times. Then we have an article in the Wall Street Journal, September 23rd, 2011, titled, Merck to pay $950 million in Vioxx settlement, by Peter Loftus and Brent Kendall. Merck and Company agreed to pay $950 million and plead guilty to a criminal misdemeanor charge to resolve government allegations that the company illegally promoted its former painkiller Vioxx and deceived the government about the drug safety. This was, as this article says, the company previously agreed to pay $4.85 billion to settle thousands of product liability lawsuits alleging Vioxx caused injuries and deaths. Follow the money. Follow the fraud in terms of the science. Maybe that's why we're seeing the president of Stanford University resign, because his research didn't measure up to the standards we would expect. Follow the corruption between the relationship of big pharma, the FDA, the researchers and scientists, and how this all trickles down into my lap in my medical journals. Family Practice, the Journal of Family Practice, and here's one. This is sort of a throwaway, but Biosupply Trends. Let's just talk about these real briefly, because these are the places where I read the articles or the summaries, and it makes a distinction in terms of what I'm going to do in terms of taking care of my patients. This Journal of Family Medicine, it comes with a fancy little flyer. It's a little advertisement, and it says this. Do you have patients struggling with agitation associated with Alzheimer's dementia? And then you get to press on a QR code. This is an advertisement. If you go into this journal, you will see that it has advertisements and it has been funded extensively by drug companies over and over again. Then we have the Journal of Family Practice, Hot Topics in Primary Care 2023. How could I help but look at this? I need to know what the hot topics in primary care in 2023 are. Biosupply trends. I looked at this one, I said, what's this about? Title, Medical Misinformation, the Consequences for Vaccination Rates. I thought, well, this will be interesting. Let's see what this article says to say. And then I looked at who pays for it. And this journal is virtually completely paid for by pharmaceutical companies. What does it say? Well, it says this about misinformation. Politicization and polarization have made finding credible information online harder than ever. Okay. Goes on. The development of vaccines is arguably one of the most important advances in the history of medicine, but in recent years, vaccination rates have significantly declined. This decline can be largely attributed to the politicization of medical information and subsequent vaccine hesitancy. Goes on to say this. When public policy decisions are based on ideology instead of scientific data and research, the situation becomes politicized. The politicization of vaccines was not one-sided. It goes on to talk about drivers of misinformation. False narratives can quickly gain traction through viral posts and memes shared and reshared by users on both sides of the political issue. Additionally, it's important to remember that just because a healthcare worker posts medical information does not mean it is true. And there's another article, Adult Vaccines, Fact versus Fiction. It says this. When a vaccine is developed, it goes through a strict and detailed process overseen by the U.S. FDA. Manufacturers must prove to the FDA the vaccine is safe before it can be administered to people. CDC and FDC also monitor the vaccine production facilities to make sure vaccines are being produced safely. Each batch of vaccines is checked before it is distributed to the public to make sure it is safe. Then there's a little byline, sort of a headline right here, and it says this. Adults need vaccines too because protection from childhood vaccinations may wane as people age, and adults may need additional vaccines every year. Well, I've always had a question, and I've looked all over the medical literature for it, but I tell my patients, as I'm supposed to, that every 10 years they're supposed to have a diphtheria tetanus booster. But I've never seen a study that said that between the age of 60 and 80, if someone doesn't get their booster at 70, they're going to lose protection against diphtheria or tetanus. We sort of get into this routine, we get into this algorithm, and boom, 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 boom. Every 10 years, get your vaccine. I think in the corporate world, that's called recurring income. But the fact is, does a 70-year-old person who's received at least 10 previous diphtheria tetanus vaccines, does he or she need one more in order to maintain the protection against diphtheria or tetanus, which both diseases, by the way, I have never seen in my entire medical career of nearly 40 years. What I'm trying to say is it isn't just in the last 3 years we've been having problems. We could have been alerted to this a long time ago. We had editors of the New England Journal of Medicine coming out and saying, listen, the world of medical research has been compromised. At some level, it's been corrupted. There is scientific fraud going on, and the driving force behind it is so often dollars. I have, in many circles, become quite unpopular because I've been willing to say that I think the agenda of Big Pharma works hand in hand with the agenda of government agencies. And I've gone on to say that Big Tech has been a part of squashing the kind of message I might put forth, whether they're canceling me off of TikTok, suppressing me on Facebook, or making it difficult for my Twitter audience to grow. They have so many tools at their disposal. I don't have those tools. I'm just going to tell you this. What we've gone through the last 3 years has got to be about learning the lesson. Follow the money, follow the fraud, follow the corruption. And at the end of the day, the ultimate big triad of tyranny, big tech, big pharma, big government, their ultimate hammer will always be censorship. Have a good weekend.